Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I'm just really pleased to see all the bright and shiny faces here. My name is Lisa Gabbert, and I'm Associate Professor in the English Department at Utah State University and Director of the Folklore Program. And today is my honor to welcome you to the 2014 Fife Honor Lecture. This annual lecture is named in honor of Austin and Alta Fife, who established folklore studies and the nationally known archives here at Utah State University. As a husband and wife team, the Fifes pioneered the documentation of folklore in the West between the 1940s and the 1970s, using summer vacations and weekends with a camping trailer, recording equipment, camera, and stenographic materials. They collected regional Western folk life, including cowboy songs, Mormon folklore, and slides of vernacular architecture, and that's just a tiny little portion of what they did. They were just prolific documenters. And we are very proud to have this year's lecture, which I think it's in its 33rd year, delivered by Dr. Peggy Bulger, former director of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress and past president of the American Folklore Society. Dr. Bulger served as the director of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress from 1999 to 2011. A native of New York State, she holds a BA in Fine Arts from the State University of New York at Albany, an MA in Folk Studies from Western Kentucky University, and a PhD in Folklore and Folklife with honors from the University of Pennsylvania. She has spent her career documenting folklife and developing and managing folklife programs. Prior to her tenure at the library at the American Folklife Center, she served as Florida Folklife Programs Administrator and Folk Arts Senior Officer for the Southern Arts Federation. In addition, Dr. Bulger is the author of South Florida Folklife with Tina Bukovalis and Stetson Kennedy, and the editor of Musical Roots of the South. She has also produced many videos, including Music Masters and Rhythm Kings, Every Island Has Its Own Songs, Fishing All My Days, and a number of recordings, including Deep South Musical Roots Tour and Drop On Down in Florida. She has served on the board of the American Folklore Society and then as its president from 2000 to 2002. She was elected as a folklore fellow, and that is generally fellows, so it's good that she's in there. She's a fellowette of AFS in 2011 and received the prestigious Benjamin Botkin Award that same year for her contributions to the field of public folklore. She has a number of other awards, including one from the Stetson Kennedy Foundation and an honorary doctorate of Humane Letters from Goucher College, where she was commencement speaker for the graduate programs. My favorite listed on her CV is that there was a mayoral proclamation in Washington, D.C. on December 13th, 2011, naming that day as Peggy Bulger Day. And I think we should have one here too. So we're just so very glad she could be here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peggy Bulger.
Yeah, that was kind of a surprise, but Peggy Bulger Day, that, and, $2.50 will get you a Starbucks coffee. Oh, I don't know. I remember first coming, I was talking to Steve Sporen before about coming to Utah the first time, a long time ago, and I was at BYU campus, and I needed a cup of coffee really bad. And I was searching everywhere, and I looked for coffee. There was no coffee. There was no tea. There was no Coke. There was chocolate. Chocolate, that's where the caffeine was. But that's a really, really fattening way to get your caffeine. Anyway, thank you all for being here. And I really want to thank the staff here at USU, and especially the faculty, the folklore program, and Dr. Lisa Gabbert, especially for inviting me to give this 2014 Fife lecture. And I'm really looking at the past lecturers. I am joining actually an illustrious group, and all of them are my heroes. So that's kind of daunting. Now, I was told that the topic of my lecture was totally open, but it should reflect my work in folklore. Now, that latitude for me is kind of daunting, and I was torn between what that topic would be today. Would it be about advocacy, intellectual property rights, music, whatever? A lot of things that I've been dealing with before I retired. But recent events in the field actually determine the scope for my remarks today. In the past year, life-changing announcements have been accelerating from my particular folklore peer group, and this underscored the fact that I am actually one of a generation of folklorists who were the first cohort in the world of public sector folklore at the state level here in the United States. I don't know about you, but there's been a sudden rash of retirements, and that word is really misconstrued, of the founding directors of established folklife programs all over the nation. It's been kind of stunning. In fact, most all of us that I know who've retired, we're now pursuing our own projects in an active retirement. Just this past year, Charlie Seaman of the Western Folklife Center joined his predecessor, Hal Cannon, in the ranks of rocking chair cogitators, which I believe that. Roby Cogswell of Tennessee, I thought he'd never retire. Elaine F. in Maryland, Claude Stevenson in New Mexico, Kate Turner in Brooklyn, Diana Parker from the Smithsonian, and Barry Burgee at the NEA. All are joining me or have joined me, as well as Jane Beck of Vermont, Jim Griffith of Arizona, Nancy Nuz of Oregon, Willie Smythe of Washington State, Phil Nussbaum in Minnesota, Hank Willett of Alabama, and many, many other baby boomers who've gone on to the next chapter of our careers after public programs administration. In fact, career is perhaps an inadequate word, for the definition of a career is, quote, an occupation undertaken for a significant period of a person's life with opportunities for progress, end quote. Now, most folklorists I know go well beyond the career track and have what I would call a calling. A calling is, quote, a strong urge towards a particular way of life. And being a folklorist certainly places one on a path for a particular way of life. I personally retired from my position as director of the American Folklife Center on December, on my birthday, December 13th, 2011, and, which was Peggy Bulger Day, by the way. And I've been shocked at actually how much pressure you can put on yourself in retirement. My retirement actually is pretty chaotic and frantically busy. I just don't get a paycheck. So here I am, actually an old gray head if I didn't dye it, and I'm offered the opportunity to pontificate. So I decided that this would be a terrific time to share with you some of my personal reflections and a few of my most embarrassing moments as a folklorist. So especially those of you who are just starting out in the field, don't be afraid, because whatever you're going to do, it's already been done before in a bad way, and you'll be better than what has gone before. Believe me. So I titled my lecture Full Circle, since I've retired not to my place of birth, which is Albany, New York, but to the place where my public folklore career began, Florida. I've also come back to the work that I had to abandon for many years when I was totally consumed with cultural programs administration and public program creation. I like that too, but I've come back to the work that most of us folklorists embrace as our passion, field work, and that is our calling. But back in the fall of 1976, most of you were not born yet, I moved to a little tiny town, White Springs, Florida, basically a town of 800 people, basically 400 white, 400 African American, on the banks of the Swanee River, only 15 miles from the Okefenokee Swamp, in the middle of nowhere. It was basically 2 hours west of Jacksonville, 2 hours east of Tallahassee, an hour and a half north of Gainesville. 800 people. We had to drive 15 miles to get to a grocery store. And that was where I was going to be based. I was going to take a one-year position funded by the National Endowment for the Arts Folk Arts Program. I was to be the first folk arts coordinator for the state. And the reason why I was in White Springs, I was based at the Stephen Foster Center, which was the home to the venerable Florida Folk Festival, an annual event held since 1953. And I think at this point, the Florida Folk Festival is the longest continually running state folk festival in the nation. It was actually created in 1953 by cousin Thelma Bolton, who was a force to be reckoned with. She was a good friend of Sarah Gertrude Knott, who had started the National Folk Festival many years before. Now, my task in this year was to conduct a survey of folk artists of the state of Florida and provide a report back to the management of the Foster Center. I think they were looking to update the people who were being invited to the folk festival. I was young, I was inexperienced enough to think that this would be possible. I had never been to Florida before. I had high hopes and big dreams. And back then, this was a very exciting time, 1976. Exciting time for folklorists, anthropologists, ethnomusicologists, all kinds of cultural workers. 1976 saw the establishment of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, the production of a summer-long bicentennial American Folklife Festival on the Mall in D.C., and the emergence of the folk arts program at the NEA. It was also the beginning of the network of state folklife programs that are now operating throughout the country. And back in 1976, there were 6 of us. And within 10 years, there were over 40 state folklorists. So it was really a boom time. It was a great time to be coming out of graduate school. But needless to say, my 1 year flashed by in an instant, and even with a peripatetic existence and a 24/7 schedule, I barely scratched the surface of the deep and rich traditional cultures that thrive in the southernmost state. I had traveled from Pensacola to Key West, from the Everglades to the Okefenokee Swamp. I'd met musicians, dancers, folk healers, craftsmen, and visionary artists. But it was obvious that the work had just begun. So happily, new grants were secured to continue the work into the future. Florida, like many states, if you get to live and work in them for long, you'll find that they're replete with traditional cultures and folk communities that are often invisible to tourists and visitors, but even to permanent residents. Florida's just the same. When I first came down to White Springs, I was amazed at what I found in that first year. And I traveled every corner of the state. I think I logged 5,000 miles on a 1969 pickup truck that year. And I would often find myself in what I call the real Florida, the hidden landscapes of Florida that are defined by ethnic and occupational traditions as opposed to beaches and theme parks. Most Americans know that Florida is a destination for new retirees, like myself, and many are attracted to the warm climate and beaches. However, when Americans retire, it appears that they want more than sun and surf. They still seek the company of their cultural peers, their tribe, if you will. As an example, I visited Tarpon Springs, which is home to over 12,000 Greek Americans. Many are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Greek sponge fishermen who came to Tarpon to harvest natural sponges in the Gulf of Mexico in the 1880s. They've been joined by Greek Americans who've retired from jobs in New York, Chicago, Boston, and other large cities. So when I first visited Tarpon back in 1976, I could swear when I got out of the truck that I had just left the United States and I was now in the Dodecanese Islands. The Greek Orthodox Church dominated the town square, and I learned that the Archbishop for the entire United States was based in this tiny little town in Florida. There were Greek restaurants, men-only coffee houses brewing the muddy, thick coffee of the Greek Isles. People were reading Greek newspapers. There was tazbuna and bouzouki music emanating from all the bars on the corner, spilling into the streets. The architecture was whitewashed plaster and Greek flags were flying everywhere. So even today, Tarpon Springs is a tourist attraction due to the unique Greek heritage that shaped this town of Americans. The folk traditions and traditional culture of this community have really, I say, is really the kind of the Greek equivalent of Brigadoon. It's really kind of astounding when you go there, and it is known actually internationally now as being a place to experience Greek culture. And by the way, happily, Tarpon Springs cultural programs are now being run by Dr. Tina Bukavalis, who for many years served as the state folklorist of Florida. This was after I left. And she retired from that job, and she went back to Tarpon Springs. She's of Greek heritage. And her retirement puts her squarely into the middle of her own personal heritage and into the thick of community activism and sustainability. And that's a term I'm going to come back to. But similar to Tarpon Springs pretty well known. The town of Bellevue, anybody hear of the town of Bellevue, Florida? No, I didn't think so. It's near Ocala. It's a tiny town, but it was settled almost entirely by Polish retirees from every major city in the United States who identify with and continue to practice their Eastern European traditions, including needlework, foodways, and ritual Easter traditions. And the Poles of Bellevue even brought a Catholic priest over from Warsaw to say the Mass in their native tongue. Over in Hernando County, which is on the Gulf side, Masaryk Town was founded in 1925 by Czech Americans from New York City. Who knew? They named this little town for the founder of Czechoslovakian independence, and up until very recently, the town was really populated by Czech American chicken and citrus farmers. But now, as always happens, changes in the air. They're being displaced by mega-sized retirement communities for friends who relocate but still want to continue affiliations from their life. And so there's even one neighborhood in the town of Masaryk Town now is called Dayton, Ohio, because everybody in the neighborhood is from Dayton. And they wanted to retire in Florida, so they all came down together. And this is interesting because I don't know if there's been very much folk life research on retirees, but it's a phenomenon that I think really needs study by ethnographers on where people retire and why they retire and what happens to them when they do retire. Further south on the Atlantic coast, this is on the Atlantic coast, is Lake Worth. Now, the other reason Lake Worth is known is that it's the home to the National Enquirer. So it has all of these British tabloid writers who've come into Lake Worth. But the other thing that Lake Worth is known for, especially back when I was there in 1976, it's home to 20,000 Finnish Americans. And back then in 1976, they still maintained a red fin hall and a white fin hall. Now that's an argument that went away decades ago in Finland, but not in Lake Worth. They were still keeping that alive. But they also played and enjoyed Karelian music, and everyone had a sauna. Now, give me a break. Just walk outside. You're in Florida. It is a sauna. No need. But, they had to have it. So even though today the population is much more diverse than it was back in '76, there's a lot of movement that goes on in Florida, you'll still find an abundance of beer halls, Finnish delicatessens, bakeries, and Lutheran churches that stand out in what is a semi-tropical urban sprawl that is South Florida. So even in an urban sprawl area like that, there still are affiliations that are kept alive. When I traveled back up to North Florida, I discovered that Jacksonville has one of the largest communities of Lebanese Americans in the nation. And at the time, and still today, the signature sandwich for the city is called the Camel Rider. What is a Camel Rider? It's basically ham and cheese on a pita bread. And in 1976, I was so provincial, I'd never even seen pita bread. I'd never heard of it, but that's how when I went into a delicatessen and ordered a Camel Rider, that's when I found out about the Lebanese American community, and that's how field work is done. Then you find, oh, what else is here? So that was pretty amazing to me. And then, as most of people know, that Miami has the largest and most vibrant Cuban community outside of Cuba, centered around Calle Ocho, or 8th Street. And these Miamians fiercely protect and pass on their old world folk traditions, but also their politics, they've had a big impact on the way that the United States and Cuba interact, these expats. But they still stage daily public domino tournaments with old men in the square playing dominoes all day, and most families still hold elaborate quinceañera celebrations to celebrate a girl's 15th birthday. And many visitors to Miami are unaware that just a few miles away from Calle Ocho and Coconut Grove, Miami is home to a huge Bahamian community that cherishes their cultural heritage and celebrates Junkanoo and Goombay festivals. And a few miles in the other direction, it's home to so many Haitian Americans. The area is known as Little Haiti. And I could go on and on with this, but you get the point, you get the idea. Florida's folk life and culture, it's like here. It's heterogeneous and it's ever-changing. It's a good thing. We need to recognize how culture functions in the real world. It's fluid, it's flexible, and it's adaptable. We as folklorists especially need to educate the public to the fact that our collective folk traditions are an invaluable resource for sustainable development and community cohesion. But moreover, these traditions need to be identified and documented and celebrated with care and respect to remain authentic and viable. And those of us who do have the calling are still needed to document and interpret traditional life in the 21st century, so there really is no time to retire. In my remarks, I want to reflect on two concepts that we all deal with every day in our work as cultural advocates. And many of you know what I'm talking about. They're terms that I encountered back in the 70s, and they continue to complicate our work as folklorists today. I'm speaking of the word authenticity and sustainability. Both terms have often been used by politicians and policymakers in self-serving ways, and the confusion over what they actually connote needs to be dispelled. I believe that when we examine the actual function of these concepts in contemporary communities, we can truly move forward towards a healthy existence in both the environmental and cultural realms, and in the community work we do as ethnographers. Could I get some water? Yes. Yeah. We'll start with authenticity. One of my favorites. Yeah. Authenticity is a confusing notion. Many Americans equate authenticity with an idealized past that somehow has been passed on, intact and revered in today's multicultural and chaotic society, looking back. They think of authentic community culture as being somewhat monocultural, unchanging, and reflective of the historical antecedents that predate our challenging present. A good example of this, of course, would be colonial Williamsburg, which is authentic to the 1700s, but it's total fiction in 2014. In fact, being authentic is to be uncontrolled and real. Reality, it's messy, it's dangerous, and it's unpredictable. This is the exact opposite of the Disney model, where all experience is controlled and safe. So an authentic experience will always be an adventure, but it will never be predictable. And those of us who worked in folklore for a while know those unpredictable moments. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about the search for authenticity in Disney. And this is one of my many embarrassing episodes as a state folklorist. I could go on and on, but I won't. I really do think, though, that the American Folklore Society should think about publishing a book of anecdotes and stories from folklorists on the gaffes that we make in the field, and that would make all the new ones coming up feel so much better. You know? Believe me, we've done it. But back to my story. Back in the early 1980s, I think it was 1983, I was working on the annual Florida Folk Festival, and every year we would program what was called a folklife area, and that would feature a local community in the state in depth. And that year we'd received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and we got matching funds from a St. Augustine millionaire. His name was X.L. Pellissier, and he was of Minorcan heritage. We were determined to showcase the vibrant Minorcan culture that still lives on in St. Augustine and still does today. From foodways like preparing gopher turtle for stew, which we can't do anymore. Gopher turtle is on the endangered species list. Oh well. I think the Minorcans might have been a little bit too robust in their culture. To weaving palm fronds into elaborate flower arrangements for Palm Sunday at the Catholic Cathedral, to growing the super hot datil pepper that's native to the island of Minorca. But as part of this whole celebration, Mr. Pellissier decided to bring over the entire cathedral choir from Mahan, Minorca, all 50 of them. And they were to perform not only at the Florida Folk Festival, but also at the newest Disney attraction, Epcot. Now, Epcot opened October 1st, 1982, so 32 years ago. Now, these folks, we brought them over. This was like the year after Epcot opened. They were all ages, all sizes, and 100% authentic. We soon found out how difficult it is to present authenticity, especially in a theme park setting. Our first mistake, it actually was my mistake, was to assume that because these people came from the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain, they would speak Spanish. Not. They speak Catalan. It's not Spanish, it's not French, and it was not a language I had interpreters for. Whew. So our Spanish interpreters were just as flummoxed as we were, and we kind of muddled on sign language and kind of pidgin Spanish and whatever, and we were able to at least get them down to Epcot. When we got there, the Minorcans actually had been ready for a trip to Disneyland because they were going to spend the whole day there. So they were wearing mostly jeans and T-shirts. Really, Minorca had reached the 20th century after all. But our Disney presenters at Epcot were horrified. Oh my gosh. They expected a group of Mediterranean islanders in traditional dress, whatever that was. But certainly, jeans were not allowed, and certainly they should look exotic for the audience. Well, that didn't happen. In addition to that, and this is really true, Disney required that all performers smile at all times. It's in the contract. This concept was not translatable to the elders of the choir, who actually kept a stern and solemn demeanor, which was the norm in the cathedral. So, there were several other things that brought up how difficult this was going to be. But in short, this group was just too darn authentic for the Disney version of authenticity. And it really brought up that, to me, that sometimes it's not a small world after all. So moving on from that, it came to me that folklorists, as we attempt to define for the public what makes for authentic culture, we need to communicate the reality and the inherent value of what's happening and what our population is today, which continues to change every year, and embrace the many cultural assets that exist within the 21st century communities. Our communities are heterogeneous and they're changing. We might disagree, we might just embarrass the powers that be, but to be authentic is to be real, not always politically or economically correct, and not always dressed the way that you want them to dress. And that's life, and we need to deal with it. The other term that's gained currency in recent years, especially in recent years, is sustainability. And I serve as an advisor to a new graduate program at Goucher College in Baltimore. It's a Master of Arts in Cultural Sustainability. And part of the mission statement for the program reads, quote, "In this era of increasing homogeneity and globalization, local history, traditions, and ways of life are among our most endangered resources and precious assets. By strengthening and building on the foundations of these resources, whether artistic, linguistic, musical, economic, or environmental, we can begin to counter the powerful forces that endanger communities around the world," end quote. It's a tall order. But I would posit that this actually ideal, this statement, is kind of key to our work as folklorists, and it informs all of our scholarship, whether we're in the academy or the public sector. But really, how do we, as folklorists and ethnographers, advance sustainability in the communities we live in and study? And unfortunately, I don't have that answer, but I do have one small example of a successful adaptation to changing economies, and it may serve as kind of a model for those of you who go on and are thinking about sustainability in the work that you're going to do. And this again goes to the idea for me of coming for full circle. Back in 1984, there were over 100 commercial shrimping boats that fished each day from the town of Fernandina Beach on Amelia Island, back in Florida. At that time, I was producing a television documentary on the history and folk traditions of Florida's shrimp fishermen, and I was interviewing members of the community who had connections to that industry. The Burbank family net-making business was thriving in 1984 with over 20 employees in a downtown metal warehouse. They were a 4 generations old enterprise. Billy Burbank Jr. and Billy III had just designed, back in the 80s, had designed nets to be the best for catching shrimp from a double trawler, which was a new kind of thing with doors on the end, with the new TEDs, or turtle exclusion devices, which was a new thing in the 80s. And they had mentored and taught the other netters in the shop, and all the nets were hand-tied. And they supplied shrimping nets for almost all of the boats in the southeast and many on the west coast. This business was a grassroots, clean micro-industry and part of Fernandina's folk culture for sure. So, jump ahead, when I retired and my husband and I moved to Amelia Island in December of 2011, I was shocked to find that only 8 commercial shrimping boats were still plying the waters out of Fernandina. And this kind of change in the environment and what's going on environmentally, which also impacts culture totally, is going on all over the world, really. But so I just, take this one little example. And for shrimping, largely due to environmental controls brought on by overfishing and also market pressures brought on by commercial shrimp farming out of Indonesia, the shrimp business in Fernandina was decimated. I immediately went downtown to see Billy III and check in on the net business. The warehouse was gone. There was just an empty lot. I was really, really upset. I was devastated. I just assumed they went out of business. However, I was told that no, the Burbank net business had just moved out to the old Pogey plant. Now, Pogey, or menhaden fishing, was an industry from the 19th century that kind of went belly up 70 years ago, little fish that they crushed up and made into all kinds of things with the oil for the Pogey fishing. There was a brick building north of Fernandina where the pogies used to be processed, and apparently the smell would have made you move off of Amelia Island in any case. So Billy had moved up to the old Pogey plant. So when I went to see him, I was heartened to see that there were about 12 net makers busy at their craft and the business was humming. Billy had made adaptations in the work that saved his small business, responding to a new market but continuing to use his skilled workers in a generations-old craft. The net makers were now being employed for a new product, sports nets. The Burbank net makers are now supplying over 80% of the goal nets and backstops for professional soccer, baseball, hockey, basketball, and other sports enterprises. In fact, Billy just won an award from Sports Circles for developing this net that's made out of Kevlar, which they make bulletproof vests out of Kevlar. It's a net that actually is invisible for TV cameras. TV cameras can't see it, but the backstops are there, and the net is as strong as a bulletproof vest. So now everybody wants the Burbank Kevlar net. And Billy's business is a multi-million-dollar business now, and it's international. Who knew? They still make shrimp nets, but it's a small fraction of the business. But really it shows how, they've adapted to the new market demands and have made they were flexible enough to save the traditional art of net making. They still do all of that putting together of the nets by hand. They do have a new person on staff who is making all of the metal, I don't know what the technical terms are, the metal pieces that hold backstops and everything, but it's in a new context. So this is, one example of the kind of flexibility and creativity that it might take to make our community sustainable in the 21st century. We can't keep saying it's got to be the same, we've got to adapt. So I'm now coming full circle. I'm now interviewing Billy again on the new business and what's happening. And I'm happy to say that we nominated Billy, and he was awarded the 2013 Florida Folk Heritage Award. So back again to the future, back to the future. I have one other story to tell about sustainability, and it's more global, and it illustrates the opposite effect. 4 years ago, when I was directing the American Folklife Center over at the Library of Congress, I was still up there, we were approached to assist the Maasai people of the Rift Valley in Kenya. The Maasai wanted to document and preserve their traditional culture on videotape for future generations, and they didn't trust the Kenyan government to be their partner in this effort. We thought that was odd, but okay. So the American Folklife Center sent a team of ethnographers over to Lake Ipia to teach the Maasai how to use audio and video recorders and to do still photography for this purpose. And we soon learned why the Maasai were so concerned to capture their way of life immediately, and we learned the dangers of enthusiastic but unthoughtful cultural tourism. Basically what had happened, the government of Kenya, in an attempt to boost tourism in the Rift Valley, had built a large tourist lodge with all of the modern conveniences, including running water and sewage. They were capitalizing on the worldwide tourist fascination with the Maasai and their traditional way of life. Every week, the lodge would bring dozens of tourists to the Maasai lands and bring them up close and personal, not only with the wildlife, but to the human equivalent of the flora and fauna, the Maasai themselves. As the scarcity of water in the Rift Valley is a perpetual and increasing problem, this new tourist lodge almost killed the proverbial goose that laid the golden egg. I'm not kidding. The resources needed to feed and water the visiting tourists put such a strain on the local water table that the Maasai were forced to travel ever further afield to graze their cattle and to find water for their own needs. Thus, not only was the government responsible for exacerbating the drought conditions in the valley, they were threatening the very traditional lifestyle that was being marketed as a tourist attraction. Well, I'm happy to say that the Maasai have been documenting their way of life now for 3 years, and they're in negotiations with Nairobi to protect their water sources. But I throw this out recognizing that Utah and Florida are not far from the Rift Valley in their need to balance water needs, environmental essentials, economic needs with human requirements. both of the residents and of the visitors that come to our state. So it's not like you can look at the environment as a separate issue. It all comes full circle. And I want to finish my musings with a circle back to my first years in Florida and tell you how that work that I did back then is impacting my life today. In 1978, in collaboration with the Center for Southern Folklore in Memphis, Tennessee, the fledgling Florida Folklife program secured a grant from NEA to conduct what was called the North Florida Folklife Project. A young folklorist from New York State, Brenda McCallum, was completing an internship at that time at the Center for Southern Folklore, and she was required to do a 3-month field project. This was her assignment, to come to Florida and do this project. At the same time, we were able to hire a young field collector and music scholar from the heart of the state. His name is Dwight Devane. Brenda and Dwight, along with Brenda's husband, Steve, who was a recordist, they began an adventure in field work to record the musical traditions of Florida, while I served as the administrator of the project. So the project team met to strategize, and we pretty much knew from my 1 year shallow surfing in those Florida Folklife Sea that we needed to hone in and prioritize in order to have any kind of results in 3 months. And we were pretty naive and we were romantic back in those days, and we searched for a model to emulate. And we found the one great and lasting effort that had been done to survey cultural heritage in Florida had been mounted 40 years prior during FDR's New Deal, of course, the Florida Writers Project. The Florida Writers Project had employed Zora Neale Hurston, Stetson Kennedy, Robert Cook, Herbert Halpert, and others to document and write about the history and culture of the state. The resulting field recordings, and I have to say the field recordings from Florida were spectacular from back then, because Alan Lomax also came down and worked with Stetson and Zora and several others. And so he had the Library of Congress state-of-the-art recording machine, which was, weighed about 75 pounds, and, it made aluminum discs. And so we had that down in Florida, and so those recordings are really astounding from the 1930s. So those recordings are now in the Florida State Archives and copies at the American Folklife Center. And I do believe they continue to be a touchstone of ethnographic excellence. And if you get into the website of both of those, you can actually access recordings from all of that era. But our team decided, we were romantic, we're going to retrace those pioneering steps that were taken during the Florida Writers Project, and we determined that we were going to hone in and record the musical traditions of African American folk artists in the same communities that were documented 40 years prior. So from March to May of 1978, the project staff documented a host of talented African American folk musicians, and I want to play just here one example. This is Moses Williams. He was known as the Doorman. He's a diddley bow player, and those of you who don't know, a diddley bow is a one-string guitar. When you didn't have money to buy a guitar, you had the wall of a house, and you took a broom wire, you stretched the broom wire between two nails, you put a can underneath that wire to make it taut, you had a glass whiskey bottle, and a pop top from a beer can, and you would play slide guitar on this one string. And Moses had made an innovation on that because he used to go around and busk in playgrounds and stuff. And so he had a hollow core door, and he had made his diddley bow on a door, and he would bring it around. And this is his version of Sitting on Top of the World. Peggy. That's Moses. Of course, Moses is past now, but most people really will tell you that's probably the most amazing diddly bow playing you'll ever hear. Anyway, when our grant funding ran out, and those of you who are going into folklore, you need to know that phrase, when our grant funding ran out, the McCallums returned to Memphis, Dwight Devane returned to Polk County, and I began writing new grants to support further work on the project. And in October of 1979, a lot happened in Florida. The Florida Folklife Program found a new administrative home in the Division of Archives, History, and Records Management, and it was renamed the Bureau of Florida Folklife. I don't know why. It just sounded more bureaucratic. And we went from a staff immediately of a staff of 2 to a staff of 12. Whoa, that was amazing. And Doris Dian, who's an ethnomusicologist and an expert on African American sacred music, was one of our new hires. So when funding was again secured in 1980, Doris, Dwight, Brenda, and I all regrouped to finish the project that we had envisioned. And we all took turns to complete the field work, with Dwight at the helm, and Doris and Dwight took the lead to create the extensive liner notes. And we worked feverishly to bring into the world, the state of the art at the time, a new 2 LP long speed record album, drop on down in Florida with really extensive liner notes included. And this came out in 1981. However, it was not only the core team that fostered this production. I was rereading the acknowledgments and thanks from this 1981 release, and it confirms how the fledgling field of American folklore was a community of widely dispersed scholars, both in the academy and the public sector, who assisted and supported each other. The original Drop On Down album credits not only the principal field workers and the Folklife Program administrators, but also David Evans of Memphis State University, Bert Feintuck at Western Kentucky University, William Ferris at the University of Mississippi, Carl Fleschauer at the American Folklife Center, Jay Orr at the Center for Southern Folklore, and Bob Teskey at the NEA, among others. So we all worked on it, and it was great. But I want to play you just one other piece from the release, and this is from the sacred side. There's one CD of, there was one LP of secular music and one CD of sacred music. Of course, with Doris there, we were able, she was especially an expert on African American shape note singing. You're familiar with shape note singing? Oh boy, okay, well this is going to be different. First of all, most people are familiar with shape note singing from white congregations, but African American shape note singing is even more different. So I want to play you. This is we did a lot of work with the Southeast Alabama and Florida Union Sacred Harp Singing Convention from the Panhandle of Florida. And it's where they use 7 shape notes instead of 4 shape notes, and it's just a different sound altogether. But this is Old Ship of Zion. They're singing the notes, fa, sol, la, fa, sol, la. There's somebody who's lining the hymn. Up and down. So some things the black and white tradition share, but it's a different sound. So that really, black shape note singing is really alive and well in North Florida and South Alabama and South Georgia. That's pretty much the Wiregrass area is where you'll find this is still being done on a regular basis. So we're really happy. It had also been documented back in the 1930s, so of course we went back in the 70s and then back again. Sadly, in 1992, Brenda McCallum tragically died at the age of 43. She lost a battle with cancer. But she had gone on from this project to go to Alabama, and she was the archivist at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And her outstanding work has been honored by the American Folklore Society's Archives and Library section with the establishment of what's called the Brenda McCallum Prize. And since 1994, this prize has recognized exceptional work dealing with folklore archives, collection, organization, and management of ethnographic materials. And actually, Randy Williams and the archive here has been a recipient of this prize. But fittingly, in 2005, the Brenda McCallum Prize was awarded to the Florida Folklife Digitization and Education Project of the Florida State Archives because they were doing a big online web presentation of all the Folklife program collections, which included many of the recordings that were collected by Brenda herself on the Drop On Down project. So skip ahead to 2012. The LP was out of print for over 20 years. The musicians who had shared their talents and creativity with us were all passed away. Turntables of 20 years ago were obsolete or rare. They're coming back, but back then they were rare. And recordings were increasingly served digitally. A new Florida state folklorist was in place, Blaine Wade, and he had taken over the reins of the program, and he had discovered the original recordings for Drop On Down in Tallahassee. He determined it was time to bring the musical legacy of Drop On Down in Florida to a new generation and to celebrate the continuity of Florida's African-American musical heritage. So he contacted a newly formed Atlanta recording enterprise. I don't know if any of you have heard of Dust to Digital. They're They were founded by Lance and April Ledbetter, a young, energetic couple who are sound recordists and love traditional music, and they do beautiful work. Anyway, they liked what they heard, they were excited, and we again worked to bring the music to a new generation. And the result is a 2 CD release with a 250-page book. And so what you just heard is from the sacred and the secular CDs in here. So from those first acetate and aluminum recordings made in the 1930s onto the vinyl LPs of the 1980s, and now to the CD and MP3 releases of the 21st century, I'm glad to say that this music is still being heard. And I'm really grateful for the work of Dust to Digital Recordings, for their interest in and ability to bring these sounds to life again. It is coming full circle for me, but also full circle for a generation of folklorists, I think, as we begin to explore the earliest work that we did is now kind of, I hate to say it, historical. I feel like a relic, you know, and really trying to bring that out now again to a new generation. So 2012, that same year, Drop On Down was re-released. The National Endowment for the Arts awarded the Best Lomax Hawes Award, which is the highest award that you can get for folklife advocacy from the National Endowment for the Arts. They awarded this to Albert Head for his lifelong advocacy of folklife and folk arts. Now, Al was responsible for establishing the Florida Folklife Program. He was actually the one who hired me to come down to Florida in 1976. He soon left and went on to establish the Louisiana Folklife Program in 1977, where he hired Nick Spitzer. And then, a few years later, he went home to his home state of Alabama and established the Alabama Center for Traditional Culture in 1980. So Al said in his acceptance speech for the NEA, quote, "If you're dealing with the arts and culture of a state, I've often said on many occasions that the folk and traditional arts reflect the personality, the soul, and really the integrity of the culture of a state better than anything else. And to not have that be a big part of your policy, your program, your goals, your mission, in terms of what you do, is a huge oversight," end quote. Al is one of my heroes, and I totally agree with his statement. I would further submit that we, as cultural advocates and documentarians, have a great responsibility to work towards cultural sustainability and to let authenticity flourish in all of its imperfections. For folklore is always authentic and waiting to sustain us all. So I know you all will come full circle eventually, and you'll follow your life's calling when the time comes. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? No? Waiting for the cheese and crackers. We got one here and then one there. Okay, yeah.
I was just going to ask for our students who are interested in maybe getting involved in something like this, but who don't have sort of the infrastructure to do it through the program or something like that. How do you begin? I mean, how do you seek out a group to start working with? How do you make entrees in that? What would that look like maybe for a student who wants to take on this kind of project for a thesis?
Well, here in Utah, you're really fortunate because there's really a bunch of really wonderful folklorists, both in the academy and the public sector, and people who have retired. And there is a Western
Association of Western States Folklorists.
Yes, and they meet once a year. It would be great if the students who are interested in this kind of work made contact with Elaine and Craig, and
We have a student stipend that's available every year, and that meeting is usually in April.
And that is a great place to go. If you go to the meeting, you'll meet people who are doing this kind of work. You can pick their brain for it's really kind of a party. It's like a weekend away, and they can't get away from you because you're all staying in the same place, and it's wonderful. You have a wonderful time, but you also learn a heck of a lot, and it's That would be how I would start it right here in Utah. There's some states where it'd be really hard because there's hardly anybody there and the distances are so great and you just, can't even imagine. Yeah. And Lane, you?
I was just going to ask you, actually, let me supplement what you said, and then I'll ask you my question. Out here in the West, there's a strong program in Oregon. They're hiring field workers off and on. A lot of the time, it's great to just go out and find a field work job. They're few and far between, but keep your eyes open, and that's a great way to get into the field and start meeting people too. I'm trying to think where else in the West they might be hiring. Idaho might have some. They have a new director up there. But, yeah. And what I was going to ask you was, the speaker was right back here, so we couldn't hear what you were saying when you were explaining about the Sacred Heart music. What you were walking back and forth. We couldn't tell what you were explaining.
I was explaining that as, especially. I'm sorry to spring shape note singing on people who've never heard shape note singing before, because I know it took me, first time I heard it, I was like, whoa, what is this? So I was explaining that everyone, there's a leader who usually gets up to lead a song. There's not like one leader. Everybody gets a song, and they to keep everybody on time, because everybody's singing a different part. They walk up and down the aisle of the church, lining it or doing, this kind of motion, which keeps everybody going at least on the same time signature. And actually, to experience shape note singing, you really have to be in the church or in the square, as they say. They sit in a square. There's 4 parts, and everybody's singing as loud as they can, and if you're in the middle of that square, it's just kind of whew, mind blowing. It's intoxicating without any substance abuse. So, yeah.
I just want to say how beautiful the Drop on Down project is in the 2012 version. You all should look at it. It's just a model. And I remember when it came out, talking to Wayne and Dwight, and it was just kind of really exciting. But it also occurs to me, that's what I remember about it, but it also occurs to me for all of you, there must have been some kind of poignant moments or difficult moments bringing that back to life. Do you have any of that kind of?
Well, actually, I was just so thrilled that, I so many times we do work and then it gets on the shelf and then nobody listens to it again, and to just have the sounds be available again and to be listened to.
Beautifully done and booklet.
Yeah. I can pass this around. Yeah.
I really appreciated the talk because it really was such a rich history of the development of Florida and the program in Florida. And Florida to me has always seemed a state that has, since the 30s or maybe even before, such a rich program, folk program. Is that because of the inherent diversity in the state, or is it because those documentarians in the 30s, like Jordan Emerson and Alan Lomax, became so famous? What is it? Florida seems, in a lot of ways, is kind of so much more developed in terms of its attention to the traditional culture.
Yeah, it's had good times and bad times too. Right now we're struggling with funding for the program. I'm now coming full circle. I'm now chairman of the Florida Folklife Council, so I'm advising the new young state folklorist Amanda Hardiman, and we definitely we're struggling for dollars. I do think that Florida had an amazing beginning because of that Florida Writers Project. It was just who knew that Herbert Halpert was down there, and he was down there. Ben Botkin came down. People came through, and they really did an amazing job. And then at the time when I came down in 1976, Southern Folklore Quarterly was actually being edited from University of Florida. And so there were a few folklorists there, but they weren't doing too much, but I mean, it's still, there was always a presence at the university, and there was always a presence, I think, in the state government, or a feeling that, gee, you know, we have all this material. The thing in recent years that has been the most amazing boon to me, and just astounded me, is that we had some young archivists come to the State Archive of Florida. Now, when I was down there in the 70s, the archives didn't want to hear from us. You know, we had to keep our own stuff in White Springs, you know, in terrible conditions. They didn't want the stuff. Nope. So when it finally went over to Tallahassee and some new young archivists came in and they discovered all this stuff, the slides, all of that, they started digitizing everything. That was that project. And they put out recordings, they put out postcards, they put out posters. They were enamored of this stuff. They saw the inherent value of it right away. And so without that, I think then we wouldn't have really had the stuff that we could go to Dust to Digital with. And so it kind of all came full circle. So I'm not really sure why, but I do know that in the 30s they had a wonderful team down in Florida. Yeah.
Because it seems like the state, I mean, all the states obviously have those projects, but there are certain states that I think have developed from those, like the long-lasting, like Nebraska.
Right.
But there's other states that have those projects that just...
Because they had folklorists. Yeah, some states didn't have folklorists. They had other people. Yeah. Yeah.
I would love to hear about the Messiah Project. Would you mind telling us a little bit about the American Folk Center's field schools?
Yeah. So right here at USU, there's going to be a field school with the American Folklife Center. American Folklife Center started doing field schools quite a while ago, and we partner with the university, and we really try to bring the expertise of our staff at, I keep saying ours, you know, I'm retired now, but anyway, my former staff, at the Library of Congress to train students how to use the equipment and you know, how to really set up a field project. So if you're interested in doing field work, if your students are interested in doing field work, this field school is coming right here. And it's going to be 3 weeks in May. And it's a perfect opportunity to see if this is what your calling is. Because, you know, if some people could try it out and they say, I don't like it, you know. But if you go to a field school and you like it, you're hooked. And sorry, but you'll be hooked for the rest of your life. Thanks. Yeah.
You talked about folklorists as cultural advocates. I'm wondering, where do you see the boundaries of folklorist's role as a cultural advocate?
Well, I think that's all individual. I really do. Of course, if you're working for an agency and you're representing an agency, you have to be very careful about what you're advocating, and in fact, you usually have to be pretty silent. That's the beauty of retirement. You can say whatever you want. But I think all folklorists in some ways have in the back of our thinking and our ideal, we have certain values that we feel are universal, and we want to advocate as much as we can. And I think there is a delicate balance when you are working for a institution, that you be careful that you're not overstepping your boundaries, official boundaries, but you can. To me, what we do most is to advocate for the people we work with, that we're not just studying a culture or studying a community and then we go home. And that is also part of the problem of being folklorist. Once you've been involved with a community, you're never not involved. I mean, it's like having a ever-expanding family, and you don't just go in and do what I call slash and burn field work. You go in, you get the stuff, and you go out. No, you're usually friends with those people for the rest of your life, and you're involved with them, and it's sad when they die, and you're involved with their families. And so being an advocate is also just kind of, I guess, being there to help them on a personal level. But in a way, you have to be careful with that, because I know many people, we get so involved sometimes we can't function ourselves. No? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It's really great.